Docking, friend of many years, Jim McCain, my old boss at the University of Montana, Governor Landon, who has done so much to bring the Republican Party into the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, members of the faculty of the Board of Regents, the patrons, ladies and gentlemen of the student body, guests, friends, my fellow Americans. I am delighted to have this opportunity to appear before you in this series under the auspices of a man who has made his mark not only in his own state, but throughout the nation, and I dare say through major parts of the world as well. I was teaching at the University of Montana when Governor Landon ran for the presidency. I have watched Governor Landon since that time, and I've been impressed with his frankness, his candor, his sincerity, his integrity. And Governor Landon belongs not just to Kansas, but he belongs to all of us. And again I say I'm delighted to be here under the auspices of this man who has done so much and achieved so much for this state and his country. We have been an Atlantic-minded nation, and understandably so. 14 of the states border the Atlantic. The majority of our ancestors reached America via the Atlantic. Most of us follow religions of transatlantic origin, and the languages that are learned in our schools are primarily those of the nations across the Atlantic. Americans who travel abroad usually begin their journeys by crossing the Atlantic. Fashions, architecture, routines of living in this nation all show strong influences from the opposite side of the ocean. They are, in short, preponderantly Atlantic by heredity, tradition, and proclivity. However, the authority as well as the territory of the United States stops at the western edges of the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic has been a kind of sea barrier for us in the sense that the Pacific has not been. In the Pacific, not only do 5 states reach the ocean, but one of them, Hawaii, literally emerges from it. In addition, we have territories of various sizes, shapes, and legal relationships spread through its distant reaches. The Aleutian Islands, which project towards the Soviet Union and Japan, are part of the state of Alaska. American Samoa, Guam, Wake, Johnson, Midway, and the Howland, Baker, and Jarvis Islands are far-flung dependencies. The Canton and Enderbury Islands are an American-British condominium. The trust territory of the Pacific Islands has been administered by the United States since the end of the Second World War. It comprises over 2,000 islands and atolls, which together total only 678 square miles of land, but which are dispersed over 3 million square miles of ocean space. World War II left a provisional American administration in Okinawa and the other Ryukyu Islands. There it has remained for a quarter of a century, almost within reach of the Asian mainland. More than a frontier, more than an avenue of communication and trade, the Pacific is a vast marine arena within which lie states, territories, and dependencies appertaining in large part to the United States. I would like to make clear that in referring to the Pacific, I do not include the Asian mainland or the waters immediately adjacent. On that mainland there are no American possessions, but there are more American forces than anywhere else in the world outside the United States. Not only is there the immense consignment in Vietnam, but large American military contingents are also stationed in Thailand and South Korea. For the first time in history, we have deployed military power en masse along the whole arc of the Asian mainland. In this manner, almost without realizing it, we have cast ourselves in the role of Asian power. We have extended the outposts of our Pacific power to China's borders. We have done so on the assumption that China is bent on military expansion, and that it is essential for the United States to contain that expansion. That we have erred in the form of our response, even if the assumption is accurate, is illustrated, in my judgment, by the war in Vietnam. The war has not contained China in any sense, nor has it even decreased Chinese influence in Vietnam. If anything, it may be having the opposite effect. What needs most to be learned from the tragic experience in Vietnam is that there is no national interest of the United States which requires us to perform the functions of an Asian power. On the contrary, it is as self-damaging as it is futile to presume that that role can be exercised by an outside power anywhere on the Asian land mass. The fact is that the nations of Asia are going to develop along social and political lines which are determined by themselves. The development will spring from their history, philosophy, and tradition. It will be based on their human and material resources. It will reflect the political realities of their surroundings. Nations outside the region perhaps can participate economically in limited ways in this process, but they cannot control the social evolution of Asia. What applies to other outside nations applies to us. We have never been a part of the Asian continent. We are not now, and we will not be in the future. However, we are a part of the Pacific, as I have already observed, and we will continue to be. Whether we will remain a Pacific power is not in question. We have no choice. What is at issue is our future role with respect to Asia. On that score, it seems to me, the character of our commitment is largely a matter of our choice. We were not forced, for example, into the present involvement in Vietnam, largely by a pyramiding of successive unilateral declarations and acts. The commitment was built to its great dimensions. The choice was ours. By the same token, this nation, through the President, still retains, in my judgment, the capacity to increase, reduce, or even to dismantle that commitment by its own calculated decisions. Whatever else may prove true of our future role in Asian affairs, I am persuaded that it will differ from the role we have played in the past. The post-war World II era has ended, whether or not we recognize it. Whether or not we realize it, we are in a period of transition in our relations with the nations of the Western Pacific. That such is the case is best illustrated by reference to Japan. Our relations with that nation have been relatively quiescent for many years. Time has brought changes in Japan which have now reached a point just short of crisis. The cloud on the horizon is the United States-Japan Security Treaty. Under the terms of the treaty, beginning in 1970, either party may announce an intent to amend or to terminate the agreement. As this date has drawn closer, the political debate in Japan over the treaty has grown in intensity. It has centered on two specific points. The first is the question of the American bases in Japan: number, location, and use. Among the Japanese, there has been a growing resentment of these bases. They are not uniformly regarded as sources of a benevolent American protection. Often they are seen as symbols of excessive foreign influence as well as hazardous nuisances. Furthermore, U.S. military airfields on occasion act to disturb the populace, not only because they occupy scarce land, but also because they pose dangers of accidental explosions and crashes. In the case of naval bases, there is in Hiroshima-conscious Japan the additional concern with the assumed danger of radiation whenever nuclear-powered U.S. vessels call at these facilities. The second specific around which the debate has centered in Japan is the question of the Ryukyu Islands, notably Okinawa, which were an integral part of Japan before World War II. At the end of that conflict, the United States occupied these islands and has since administered them through the Defense Department. The Japanese Peace Treaty of 1951, however, left dangling, so to speak, certain matters pertaining to their final disposition. While the United States retained administrative control, Japan was not required to relinquish sovereignty. Moreover, this nation has since stated on more than one occasion that there is no question that Japan possesses residual sovereignty over the Ryukyus. Nevertheless, the United States has converted Okinawa into a great military depot. Bases on the island are specifically exempted from certain restrictions, which are in effect on similar U.S. installations in Japan proper. In 1960, the United States agreed that bases on the Japanese main islands cannot be used for, quote, military combat operations, unquote, without the agreement of the Japanese government. But by contrast, the same inhibition is not in effect in Okinawa, which has served as a staging area for the war in Vietnam and for B-52 bomber operations. Finally, there is a most fundamental difference. We have agreed not to store nuclear weapons in Japan proper. There is no such agreement respecting Okinawa. The military bases relate to the larger issue of Japan's future military role in the Pacific. What is involved in this question is the continuance of a situation in which the primary responsibility for defending Japan, and indeed the entire Western Pacific, falls to the United States. Over the years, this state of affairs has cost us untold billions of dollars. Its persistence is now beginning to appear somewhat anachronistic. A quarter of a century after World War II, and with a Japan that is the third greatest industrial power in the world. Many Japanese are restless under United States military surveillance of their homeland and adjacent waters. On the other hand, there is also a conflicting factor of Japanese anxiety that American military protection may be withdrawn. Out of the dichotomy has come a view that Japan should rearm beyond the modest self-defense forces which it possesses and assume a part of the defense functions which are now being discharged by this nation. The view has adherents not only in Japan but in certain quarters in the United States. All of the issues I have discussed so far have a significant characteristic in common. They are military matters. There are, of course, also non-military matters in dispute between Japan and the United States, as, for example, certain barriers to trade and investment. The fact remains, nevertheless, that the main source of friction in U.S.-Japanese relations today is to be found in disagreement over military questions. I emphasize this point because there has been some tendency to avoid public consideration of these matters in connection with foreign policy. Yet the questions are fundamental. The future of the U.S.-Japanese relationship will be very shaky indeed if we proceed to try to base it preponderantly on our military convenience in the Pacific, notwithstanding the irritation and hostility which may be caused thereby in Japan. It seems to me there is a need for great alertness to changing Japanese attitudes respecting our military activities. While some sentiment already exists in Japan for the removal of all U.S. military bases, I do not think that that is the dominant view. There is rather a general desire to see a reduction in the number of U.S. bases in Japan. A prompt response to this desire, I believe, would not only meet Japanese wishes, but would also correspond to the interests of this nation. Certainly, it would dovetail with our present efforts to reduce federal expenditures and, in particular, expenditures abroad. In my judgment, it would also act in timely fashion to preserve an accommodating tone in United States-Japanese relations. Indeed, I am persuaded that much of the growing controversy with Japan could be dispelled if it were simply stated that we are prepared to abide by Japanese desires respecting the bases. The installations are maintained at great cost to this nation on the grounds of the contribution which they make to Japanese security and hence indirectly to the security of the United States. If the bases have now ceased to have that function in Japanese calculations, how can they possibly serve a useful purpose in ours? They become, in fact, a growing liability if they cause mounting friction between this nation and the Japanese populace. Whatever the sentiments on the question of American bases in Japan, Okinawa is the looming issue in Japanese-American relations. It is the lightning rod, so to speak, which has attracted most of the arguments, most of the protest, and most of the attention. There is strong and growing pressure within Japan and Okinawa for the immediate repossession of full control over the Ryukyus. It seems to me that we have delayed a long time, perhaps too long, on this sensitive issue. Okinawa is Japanese. We have never claimed otherwise. I see no just or rational alternative other than to try to arrive at a fixed time schedule for the progressive and prompt return of administrative control over the Ryukyu Islands to Japan. In restoring Japanese administrative control over Okinawa, moreover, it seems to me that there are also strong arguments against insisting on a deal which will permit the use of the military bases in ways which are not acceptable to the Japanese people. There will be, I am sure, cries of anguish in some quarters at any significant modification of our right to unrestricted use of Okinawa. Nevertheless, entrenched parochial interests cannot be permitted to prevail in this most critical matter. Okinawa is undoubtedly a great military convenience, but it is by no means indispensable. The fact is that there have been enormous technological developments in the military field since the Second World War. We now have missiles which can carry nuclear weapons into space. We have planes which can carry them in the atmosphere, over the ocean. We have ships which can carry them on the ocean, and submarines which can carry them under the ocean. We also have other bases in the Pacific, bases which are under unchallenged American sovereignty, where nuclear weapons can be stored and where strategic air command planes with nuclear weapons may be based without question or complaint. As I have already noted, the issues of the bases and Okinawa relate to the future of Japan's military role. Here, too, it seems to me that a greater sensitivity to Japanese popular sentiment is essential. It would appear particularly ill-advised for the United States to try to push the Japanese towards a new and expanded military role in the Western Pacific. To be sure, the Japanese may one day raise the present level of their self-defense forces. They may even one day amend their constitution in order to possess other than self-defense forces. Any such decisions, however, should result from Japanese political processes which reflect Japanese judgment of Japanese needs, judgments for which the Japanese accept full responsibility. They should not result from American pressures, reflect American judgments of American needs, and for which this nation, in the end, will have to bear responsibility. If the Japanese do not assume the military burdens which the United States would relinquish when the bases in Japan are reduced in number, and those on Okinawa are restricted in use, some will ask, who will defend the Pacific? Presumably, it is fear of China which gives rise to this question. It does not follow, however, if the Chinese are bound on expansion, that they are capable of trans-Pacific aggression. Indeed, President Nixon has made it clear that he does not buy the contention of some defense advisors that a thin anti-ballistic missile system is needed because of the Chinese threat. A thrust of military power across the Pacific is quite a different matter from expansion on the Asian mainland. Even in the latter case, there is a difference of view as to the nature of Chinese continental pressure and what constitutes the principal danger to orderly progress in Asia. Among the nations of Southeast Asia, for example, it is commonplace to find that the threat of Chinese military aggression is rated a more remote menace than the immediate problems of economic underdevelopment and political instability, which, in some cases, stem from internal economic disparity from two or more countries within the region. These latter problems can hardly be met by U.S. defense outposts in the Western Pacific. Rather, their solution requires cooperation for constructive purposes among Southeast Asian nations and with other nations outside that region. In fact, such cooperation has begun, and it is taking two forms. First, there are groups of states within the region, such as the newly formed Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Second, there are regional organizations with outside members, such as the Asian Development Bank. The bank includes European and North American subscribers whose margin resources can play an important, if peripheral, part in the progress of the Asian nations. In this connection, there seems to me to be considerable merit in Japanese suggestions that the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan should form a Pacific community to help developing countries. I should add that in a grouping of this kind, Japan can play a most significant part. Indeed, in my judgment, it is in the sphere of economic development wherein lies Japan's principal potential for a contribution to the peace and the progress of the Western Pacific. I have talked of several facets of the situation in an effort to place the needs of our Asian policies in clearer perspective of the distinction between a Pacific power, which we have no choice but to be, and an Asian power, which we can and should choose not to be, of our military relations with Japan and the heat which is rising from the issues of the bases, Okinawa, and the overall Japanese role in the security of the Western Pacific, and finally of economic development in the Asian countries and the possibilities of cooperative aid. There are several other related questions which need to be touched on to complete this discussion. One concerns our relations with mainland China. Strictly speaking, China is not of the Pacific, but of Asia. Yet the very vastness of China projects its relevance not only over the Asian mainland and the Pacific, but in fact throughout the entire world. It is not possible to talk about the future of international peace, let alone about our future in the Pacific, without reference to the great nation which lies on its farther shore. China will not remain forever, as is now the case, in substantial isolation. Its proper role is as a leading nation in the councils of the world. Sooner or later, China will assume that place. It seems to me the Japanese have long since come to recognize that prospect, and there are indications that they are seeking to bridge the gap with China. Even if we could, there is no cause for this nation to impose obstacles of any kind, either spoken or unspoken, to increasing Japanese contacts with China. On the contrary, such efforts, whether in the economic, cultural, or political fields, might well be encouraged. They can serve not only Japan's needs for trade, they can contribute to clearing up a whole range of enigmas involving China and the security of the Western Pacific. In that fashion, they can be helpful in bringing about an enlightened approach to the building of a stable peace in that region. For our part, and for much the same reasons, I see no purpose in imposing any special restrictions on the travel of Americans to China, nor do I see any reason not to place trade with China in non-strategic goods on the same basis as trade with the Soviet Union, Poland, and other communist countries. For a decade and a half, we have sought to maintain a rigid primary and secondary boycott of Chinese goods. The effort is unique in our history, and it finds no parallel among the present practices of other nations with respect to China. In my view, we would be well advised to abandon this antiquated pursuit of China's downfall by economic warfare and treat with the Chinese in matters of trade as we treat with European communist countries, no better, no worse. It seems to me the Nixon administration's announced intention to reopen previous offers to exchange journalists, scientists, and scholars with China is well-founded. The cancellation of the meeting in Warsaw on February the 20th, at which these offers were to be reiterated, is regrettable. One can only hope that another opportunity will soon present itself, and hopefully that the official offers will be made and accepted. Trade, travel, and cultural and scientific exchanges are relatively tangible issues in our relationship with China. Hence, they seem to be more readily amenable to resolution. Perhaps that is why current discussion of the relationship with China tends to concentrate on them. Similarly, the present debate is intensive on the question of Chinese admission to the United Nations and United States diplomatic recognition of Peking. These issues, too, seem susceptible to clear solution. They are not, however, at the root of the difficulties. To try to resolve them at this point may be a useful intellectual exercise, but it also tends to put the cart of the difficulty before the horse. The fundamental problem of United States-Chinese relations is the status of Taiwan. It is a problem which is as complex as it is crucial. It is not an either-or issue. It is not really soluble in an enduring sense in terms of two Chinas, as has been suggested in recent years, because there are not two Chinas and the attempt to delineate them is synthetic. The fact is that Taiwan is a part of China and China is a part of Taiwan itself. And these are some factors which we should remember at all times. There are signs of difficulties in our relations with the Philippines, especially in the field of trade and investment, and with respect to U.S. military bases. In my judgment, however, none of the problems which confront us is of a nature as to be beyond reasonable solution in the light of the general cooperation which we have long enjoyed with the Philippines. Yet it is precisely this basic cooperation jeopardy. It is adversely affected by a vestigial tendency, a hangover from pre-independence days, to continue to think almost automatically in terms of special economic privileges and concessions. Similarly, in the field of foreign relations, there is an inclination to expect that the policy of the Philippines government inevitably will mirror our own attitudes. Therefore, such departures as the recent Philippine initiation of contact with communist countries somehow seems inimical to continued warm United States-Philippines relations. That is ironic, inasmuch as we have long since had contact with most of these countries. It is not a law of nature. It is an Aesopian fable that familiarity must always breed contempt. A half-century of familiarity, which was crowned with the common sacrifices of World War II, laid the basis not for a mutual contempt, but for an enduring friendship between the Filipino and American people. It seems to me that we need to bestir ourselves now if this mutually valuable tie is not to be lost. Indeed, it would be my hope that the new administration would give prompt attention to this matter. To allow barriers of estrangement to be raised by negligence or nonsense is to admit a serious disability in our capacity to order our relations with other countries, notably those which have gained independence since World War II. After all, if we cannot hold the confidence, the friendship, and the respect of a people with whom we have been intimately associated for half a century, the Filipinos, what can be expected with regard to other nations in Asia with which we have had little or no historic connection? Indonesia is one such nation. Formerly the Dutch East Indies, this immense island chain was largely unknown to Americans during the colonial era. In the post-independence period, there has been a considerable contact, but it has been uneven and unpredictable. In recent years, there has been a deterioration which, at times, has reached almost the point of outright mutual hostility. The pendulum apparently is now swinging, and hope exists once again for a more agreeable situation. It will take time, however, for us to form a balanced view of this enormous island nation, which in terms of population is the 6th largest in the world. It will take time, too, for Indonesia to emerge from its accumulated political and economic ills. The burden of the past is both heavy and pervasive. The United States can do little to speed up the development of a better association with Indonesia. Indeed, in present circumstances, the best policy is to accept our own limitations in this regard. To be sure, there are gestures of goodwill which can be made in the form of technical, scientific, and educational cooperation. Moreover, through regional aid channels, such as I have already discussed, some assistance can be provided to Indonesia for economic development. That is a far cry, however, from self-delusive assumptions that by sending Americans to fight in Vietnam, we have somehow saved Indonesia from communism, or that the astute efforts of United States agencies and enough money in some miraculous fashion can act to delineate the emerging structure of the Indonesian nation. Having described the problems which confront the United States in the Pacific, I feel that I have an obligation to close with a few general words of prescription. Almost 50 years of association with the Pacific, as a student, as a U.S. Marine, as a teacher, and as a very frequent visitor, all these prompt me to do so. A quarter of a century of political experience, on the other hand, impel me in the other direction. In these years of specializing in foreign relations, both in the House and Senate, I have come to recognize the general absence of finality in the disposition of major international problems. Nevertheless, I did remark at the outset that whatever our future in the Pacific, that future will be unlike the past. I am now under some compulsion to fill in details which sustain the general observation. The most fundamental new factor in the situation, as I see it, is the appearance of at least one new generation since my generation began to grapple with the post-World War II Asian situation, and in particular, and with a singular lack of effectiveness, with the monumental upheaval of the Chinese Revolution. This new generation, you, is a source of hope for the future. It is a hope which largely derives from the interest young people now take in the affairs of the other side of the Pacific. That interest is more profound and far better informed than was the case 2 decades or so ago. It used to be that in an Atlantic-minded nation, the consideration of Asian questions was left largely to a relative handful of Americans, to old Asian or to old China hands, whose attitudes were churned out of a mixture of 19th century religious altruism, political idealism, cold cash imperialism, and unscrupulous adventurism. World War II altered this mixture. The Korean War modified it further, and now Vietnam has changed it greatly. The attitude which once held sway in this nation with respect to our relations with Asia and the Pacific have lost most of their relevance and much of their potency. If there is to be a worthwhile future in the Pacific, it seems to me that United States policies for the problems of the Asian littoral will not be left in old Asian hands. Rather, they will take on the sense and sensitivity of young American hands. The problems will be dealt with in a new spirit of cooperation and collaboration, free of attitudes of dominance or condescension. The keynote of a new policy for contemporary Asia, as I see it, is mutuality. Its characteristics will be mutual respect, mutual appreciation, and mutual forbearance. For us, there is no choice. We must make the effort to put our policies into that perspective. We will not only continue to live in the Pacific, we will also have to learn to live with the Pacific and the nations of its western reaches, facing our relations with its peoples, with the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Koreans, the Indonesians, and others, henceforth on a profound respect for the equal dignity and worth of all. Thank you. Senator Mansfield, you have given us a priceless experience, a scholar's analysis of a crucial issue of our time delivered by a statesman in a position of high public and political responsibility. And I commend you again for what has become your hallmark, a forthrightness with which you express your views. Senator Mansfield has graciously consented to remain here on the platform to answer questions for as long a time as this can prove a rewarding experience. I know many of you must depart for your 11:30 classes. But while this is taking place, I would like to inform you that we will follow the usual format. We'll alternate between a student with a question and a member of the press corps with a question. Do we have a question over here? Will you identify yourself, please?
Yes, Doctor. Tom Parmley with WIBW in Topeka. I have a question for Senator Mansfield. Senator, Defense Secretary Laird was quoted this morning as saying that on occasion American troops have entered Laos on military missions, and that he, Laird, does not regard this as an escalation of the war in Vietnam. What's your position on that statement?
I would agree with Mr. Laird in that respect, because unlike Cambodia, Laos occupies a very different situation. We have been penetrating Laos for some years now with bombers based in Thailand. This is not a serious situation. It is not a sign of a real escalation, in my opinion. It would be quite different if what had happened in Laos was to happen in Cambodia. Next question.
Ralph Titus with the K-State Radio Network.
Ralph Titus, your microphone isn't on, Ralph.
Senator, another question regarding Defense Secretary Laird. He said in Saigon last night he'll ask Congress for $70 million to modernize the South Vietnamese Army. Your comment on that, and what are its chances in Congress?
Oh, I would be delighted to vote for an appropriation of that sort. The sooner the South Vietnamese Army can be trained, made more effective and efficient, the sooner we'll be able to get out of South Vietnam. Next question.
Another question for Senator Mansfield. This is Paul Darby of KMAN Radio. Senator Mansfield, the North Vietnamese and the Communists are continuing their bombing of South Vietnamese cities. How do you think this will affect our policy as to not bombing North Vietnam at the present time? And in relation to this, you mentioned the new generation is coming up which will set foreign policy. Do you think this will push us back towards a more isolationism?
Well, to answer your second part of your question, I do not think that those of us who are disturbed about the tragic and barbarous war in Vietnam are any more isolationist than we were before. We're just aware, we have a greater comprehension of the realities of the time, and we do not think we should be the world's policemen. As far as the bombing of the North is concerned, I hope most sincerely that it will not be resumed, because I think the focus should be placed on Paris. That is where President Nixon is exerting his greatest efforts, and that is where the final solution will have to be made, not on the battlefield. Do we have a question from a student?
I have one further question, Senator Mansfield. There has been considerable speculation on the national international money markets as to whether the French franc will be devalued. Could you comment on this and the possibility of it affecting our American dollar?
Well, you're getting me out of my field. I don't know too much about money or finance or evaluation, devaluation, or revaluation. All I know is that last November, when everybody expected de Gaulle to devalue the franc, which would have affected the underpinnings of the pound and would have brought an evaluation of the mark upward and perhaps had some effect on the dollar, that he crossed everyone up. Note that there is a flow of gold out of France. The French reserves are down considerably at the present time. There's talk about a devaluation of the franc. Mr. de Gaulle is someone who cannot be prophesied about. You just cannot predict what he'll do. But if there is a devaluation of the franc, it will not affect the German mark except in a good way as far as the economics of the situation are concerned. It very likely will have a bad effect on the British pound, and it may have some effect, though to a considerably lesser degree, on the American dollar.
Next question.
Don Pfeiffer, a student. Assuming that China is playing up the border conflict with the Russians to unify their country, what meaning does this have for Americans, and does the anti-Maoist sects still remain a threat to China?
Well, China isn't carrying on these activities against the Soviet Union to solidify mainland China. It is already solidified despite the Cultural Revolution and evidences of discontent in various provinces such as Yunnan, Shenzi, and others. What we are seeing is something which has been going on for more than a decade. The clashes between the Soviet Union and the Chinese along the 4,000-mile frontier which separates their two countries occur almost daily. You just don't see much in the way of publicity about them. But you may recall that in the middle of the last century, around the years 1858 and 60, two treaties were signed under which the Manchus were forced to give up to the Tsars territories north of the Amur, east of the Ussuri, including such places as Vladivostok and the region around Khabarovsk, and extending almost westward to the area of Outer Mongolia. And then in the region around Alma-Ata, another area was given up, and the Chinese look upon these Russian-occupied lands as theirs, and with their population estimated at 750 million, increasing somewhere in the order of 12 to 15 million a year, they're going to have to look out in some direction. That direction is not Southeast Asia, even though it is underpopulated by Asian standards. That direction is Siberia. That is the direction toward the Soviet Union. And the basic difference, I think, between the Soviet Union and China today is not based on ideology, but is based on territory, and indicates that this gulf between them is wide and deep, and may well get wider and deeper in the years ahead.
Another question? Yes.
Ed Fulton from United Press International. Do you feel that the Paris peace talks, Senator, are the only vehicle for ending the war in Vietnam?
Yes, I do. I know of no other at the present time, although I wish there would be less publicity in Paris, that the radio, the TV, and the newspapers would be excluded in some fashion, so that the representatives of Saigon, the NLF, Hanoi, and the United States could meet together in private and see if we couldn't arrive at some decision which would bring about, in the words of President Nixon, a reasonable solution to this struggle.
Am I still on? Is this still on?
Oh. Student.
Yes, I'm there on journalism. I'd like to ask if you anticipate a reversal in American attitude towards admitting Red China into the United Nations, and what do you consider will be the effects of the current opinion?
I couldn't answer your question because that matter will not come up until next year. It's been decided, I believe, in the General Assembly this year. It is my belief that each nation ought to make up its own mind as to what it should do vis-a-vis China. After all, if a nation is sovereign, independent, and free, it has that prerogative, and it should not be subject to pressures by us or anyone else. However, I must in all candor say that I have never seen any indication that China wants to be admitted to the United Nations, nor have I ever seen any indication that China wants to be recognized by the United States. So it might be a move which could succeed and end up with the Chinese declining to join the one or be recognized by the other.
Next question.
Senator Walt Biddle with KTSB TV Topeka. You've commented briefly this morning on a limited anti-ballistic missile system There have been some reports in the press the last couple of days that perhaps President Nixon is reconsidering his stand on that. What are your feelings on a limited anti-ballistic missile system?
Well, I have grave questions about the installation of an ABM system. This is nothing new with me. I had the same questions in my mind during the last 2 years of the previous Democratic administration under President Johnson. But we're not certain what the figures will be. We start out with $3 billion, now we're up to $9.4 billion for a thin system. It appears to me that if we're going to get into a negotiation situation with the Soviet Union, why not try that first before we go ahead with the system? Furthermore, why can't we wait and be absolutely sure that the system will work? We've wasted $23 to $24 billion already in various missile systems which have either not worked, become useless, or been discarded. Furthermore, if we do embark on an ABM system, a thin line, it may hinder negotiations despite what some of the witnesses before the Foreign Relations Committee had to say. It might form the foundation on which a thick system would be built, and the figures for that are anywhere from $80 to $100 billion. In my opinion, it would be more. If we start out like this, the Russians are going to match us. It's going to be a case of act and react. And when we spend $100 billion, we'll be up here then where we are down here now. And what about the problems in our cities? What about our internal needs? What about the problems affecting some of our backward rural areas? And what good will it do to build an external security if at the same time you have internal insecurity, which will get worse because you can't apply the necessary funds, know-how, and knowledgeability to it? One more thing. May I say that those of us who question the ABM are not against the ABM if it's needed, if it's proved. But we do think that there is a need for continued research and development, and all of us have advocated that instead of placing the thin line down now, that we continue the research and development program. President Nixon will make his decision today or tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest, I would assume, and I'm sure that no matter what it is, it will be a decision which he will make because he thinks it will be in the best interest of the nation.
Another question. Student.
Senator Mansfield, I'm Andy Clark, political science junior. There was a news report the other day regarding the continuing conflict in Thailand between the loyalist and insurgent forces. The government army reported killing insurgents with the uniform of the regular North Vietnamese army. What is your opinion on this in light of our SEATO agreement and in light if Thailand would ask for our help?
Well, in the first place, I would have to have a little more proof than a press report that there was a soldier, one soldier found in a North Vietnamese army uniform somewhere in Thailand. There are North Vietnamese and have been since 1948 in the northeast provinces of Thailand. They numbered about 45,000 and their loyalty initially was to Hanoi. Just what the situation there is, I am not at all certain, but I would gravely doubt that any North Vietnamese soldiers have been in Thailand or that any units of that army are engaged there. There is some insurgency within Thailand itself, which I think has been overemphasized for the purpose of creating an impression in this country which would bring about more assistance to the Thais. As far as the Southeast Asia Treaty is concerned, I would say that I was one of the signatories to that treaty along with Secretary Dulles and the late Senator Alexander Smith of New Jersey. I do not look upon the SEATO Treaty as a legitimization of the war in Vietnam, nor would I look upon it as a legitimization for a war in Vietnam based on, in Thailand, based on what information has come to my attention to date. Furthermore, it appears to me that with the actual practical withdrawal of Pakistan, France, and the United Kingdom, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, from SEATO, that this paper document, which was never very strong, has lost much of its remaining potency.
Next question.
Ed Fulton from United Press again. You had mentioned launching trade agreements with China. Have you heard any rumblings from Chinese officials that indicate they would be willing to make these trade agreements on non-strategic products?
No rumblings at all, but what we did was to impose a primary and secondary boycott on China, the only nation in the world. If you go to Hong Kong today and you buy something in Hong Kong, you've got to get a certificate of origin. And if you don't show that, whatever you buy is subject to expropriation. Well, you can buy something, give it to the national of another country, and he can take it for you, or other countries can come in and buy. What we did was to act unilateral. What we ought to do now is to act unilaterally, withdraw this primary and secondary boycott, and let American merchant traders take their chances.
Student has a question.
Mike Ellenbecker. At the present, it appears that the representatives of the peace talks are meeting only once a week in Paris. If so, does it not seem that it would be more important to meet more often? And what are these representatives from the United States doing in this week when they're not meeting?
Well, I'm not privy to what they're doing on their days off, but I do agree with you. They ought to meet every day. They ought to do something that I would not allow the Senate to do, and that is they ought to meet around the clock, if need be, and to meet privately in any way possible. The important thing is to achieve a peace, and not to take 5 or 6 days off out of every week, or 8 or 9 days off out of every 10 days. Get on the dime, get busy, keep talking, see what points you can compromise, and see what you can do in the way of bringing about a resolution of this conflict to the end that the continuing loss of lives in Southeast Asia can be brought to an end.
Next question.
Senator Mansfield, this is Paul Darby once again. One final question. How do you view the Soviet Union's recent publication of the Chinese border provocation, supposedly on its border, with respect to the Communist Party meeting which is coming up in Moscow in May? Is this a propaganda move for support? How do you view this?
Well, I think that they're trying to isolate China among the associated socialist states because there is a struggle for control with Russia way in the lead, but Russia is having her difficulties with the socialist states in Eastern Europe, and if she can divert attention away from places like Czechoslovakia and concentrate it on places like the border clash on the Ussuri, then I think they figure that it will react to their benefit and they will achieve a propaganda coup and a weakening of China's position.
Student question.
Thank you. My name is Susan Long. I'm a resident of Manhattan. These are two questions about the Senate itself. I'd like to know what chances you see for rejuvenation of the Democratic Party, perhaps exemplified by Senator Kennedy's move up in power. Also, secondly, I'd like to know what chances you see for modification of the draft at the present time.
Well, let me answer the second part of your question first. No chance. I was one of those who voted against the extension of the Draft Act in '67 because I think it contains too many inequities. It's too unfair. It gives a certain group in our young population a privileged or semi-privileged status, but it doesn't apply it to the poorest youngsters who have no outs by which they can evade the draft. I would far rather see a system of universal military service which would treat everyone alike rather than the present system, which I think is not fair. Getting back to the first part of your question, the Democratic Party may be down, but it's never out. And with such candidates as Ed Muskie and Ted Kennedy coming up, I think we will be in very good shape in the years ahead, and I think so especially as it affects the future of Senator Kennedy, who has picked up the fallen standards of his brothers.
The press has no more questions. Any more student questions? Senator, we are doubly grateful for your taking the time to respond to these questions, and we are now adjourned.